Okay, so again, like all the other sessions that we go over the chapter, make sure that you're taking notes in some way, shape, or form. Last time we finished up chapter 4, and what I really hope to do in these sessions is to kind of explain and describe what's going on here. On the one hand, it's, you could always read the chapters yourself, but sometimes it's a little bit more helpful to have it really explained in a way so that it makes sense. And I would say the chapter that we covered last time, chapter 4, is probably one of the most important chapters, not just for this particular section, it is, but for maybe our entire semester. And if you recall, Chapter 4 was really the causes of the revolution, especially coming across questions like, the chronological order questions or the matching questions. You're going to want to be familiar with kind of the processes of how all of those events led to the unfolding of the revolution. What order does, the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the First Continental Congress, how are all of those, first of all, what are those things, right? So like the definition of the Stamp Act for sure. But how are they all related to one another? And that kind of helps describe how the events unfolded. But in short, essentially, we talked about the 7 Years' War, right? How that led to reforms like the Stamp Act. And during the Stamp Act, of course, Stamp Act crisis, the Stamp Act Congress, how those led to outcries, especially about this idea of taxation and representation, and ultimately a back and forth between the colonies and Great Britain when it came to these various new laws and new reforms, right? In some instances, there was violence, like the Boston Massacre or the Gaspee Affair. In some instances, Parliament backed down, right? Like in the case of the Stamp Act, or even in the case of the Townshend duties, removing certain taxes. And then there were cases where Parliament didn't back down, like, for example, the Coercive Acts. And it was the Coercive Acts against Massachusetts that ultimately led to the First Continental Congress, which is kind of where, in some ways, Chapter 4 concludes with the Continental Congress. And the purpose was to get rid of the Coercive Acts and to take some precautions in the meantime, believing that what Great Britain had did to the colony of Massachusetts was not right, was unjust, and that if they can do it to Massachusetts, they could do it to other colonies. And in the meantime, right, they said they're going to wait a year and then meet at a second Continental Congress. And this is essentially where Chapter 5 picks up. So again, the context is the First Continental Congress, 1774, petitions Great Britain. So the Continental Congress is a meeting of all the colonies. Petitions Great Britain to get rid of the Coercive Acts. Says we'll meet 1 year later at the Second Continental Congress, which meets 1775 to 1776. And says, we'll kind of reevaluate when that time comes. And the hope was that, just like in the case of the Stamp Act, when the Stamp Act Congress met, the hope was that perhaps Great Britain would remove the Coercive Acts and there'd be cause for celebration. That was not, in fact, the case. In fact, what had happened in between these two events, right, the first and the second, was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In other words, while the rest of the colonies were waiting for, and this was in Massachusetts, while the rest of the colonies were waiting on some sort of parliamentary response by the Coercive Acts, or hopefully to get rid of them, in Massachusetts, British soldiers and Minutemen are currently engaged in essentially a war. So that's a very important distinction to make, is that the fighting starts first and then the colonies decide to declare independence. It's not as if the 13 colonies broke away and then a war broke out. It's that a war broke out and then the colonies decided to essentially separate. And so there were a couple of things that really made the push towards independence a lot easier, even at the Second Continental Congress. Even though the first kind of priority, you might say, when the Continental Congress met once again in 1775 was essentially to defend the colonies. So one of the first things they did was to create an army, and they placed George Washington to be in charge. And George Washington's appointment to be the general of what is now the Continental Army, not just, the militia of Virginia or the militia of Massachusetts, not separate, but a combined Continental 13 colonies fighting force. It was important to put George Washington in charge because he was from the South. And that represented that this conflict was not just a Massachusetts-Britain conflict, but this was in fact a conflict that all the colonies could essentially be on the same page about. Meanwhile, King George III in Great Britain hired Hessians. Hessians are soldiers for hire, right? Specifically from Germany. All right, they're German soldiers for hire. And this made a lot of people in the colonies who were maybe a little bit hesitant about declaring war against Great Britain, or at least continuing the war. They made them kind of push more towards independence. The idea being, well, if Great Britain is hiring these soldiers, they certainly have some sort of intention to use them in the colonies, and therefore the imperative to defend yourself is all the that much greater. At the same time, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. Common Sense made the argument, or made the case, for independence. And, especially in these very early years, right? If we take just 1774 to 1776, in these early years, you have two things going on. You have the war that's going on, right? That initially breaks out in Massachusetts. And then you also have those that want independence. That is to break away. And between these years, those two things were separate, right? There were some who were perhaps advocating defending the colonies against British aggression, but weren't quite ready to declare independence yet. And then there were some who, wanted to fully, completely break away. It was mostly because of Common Sense, which was a political pamphlet. And again, Thomas Paine is the author of it. A political pamphlet that made the case for independence. It was the most widely read document in the colonies prior to the eve of the American Revolution, and was incredibly powerful in persuading the colonies to go through with it, to break away. One thing that Thomas Paine did really well was that he explained independence and separation in terms that everybody could understand. He used a lot of religious imagery. Again, religion and Christianity being something that a lot of the colonists were familiar with. And said things like, what sense does it make for an island to rule over an entire continent? And, when put like that, of course it makes, it makes sense. And so in July of 1776, all 13 representatives at the Second Continental Congress approved for declaring independence against Great Britain. It should be noted that New York technically abstained from the vote, but more or less there was a consensus. And on July 4th, 1776, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, who will just say it was the primary author of the, I'll say again, Declaration of Independence, DOI. It was technically a group project. 5 people were assigned to work on the Declaration. Jefferson, Franklin, and John Adams were amongst the group project. and Jefferson was assigned with writing it. And so mostly, we would consider him the primary author of it. And what the Declaration of Independence did, to understand what this document is, it's pretty straightforward. It just states reason for separating from Britain. The Declaration of Independence is not a governing document. We're not, ruled by the Declaration of Independence today. It is simply a document that states the reasons for separating from Great Britain. We're probably most familiar, if we have heard of the Declaration of Independence before, with the preamble, which pretty much outlines what I would say a lot of what we consider founding principles. Of course, the most famous line being maybe the fact that when Thomas Jefferson said that all men were created equal with inalienable rights, that is, rights that are given at birth and cannot be taken away, and those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson also talks about when governments don't protect those rights and are abusive towards them, then people have the right to alter or abolish their government. And that very brief kind of paragraph in the preamble, again, is probably the most well-known part of the Declaration. But if you actually read the rest of it, which you'll have an opportunity to do as one of the primary sources for this section, it's pretty much just a complete laundry list of all the grievances that the colonies have against the British. The fact of quartering soldiers in our homes, raising taxes on us without representation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So an important thing to take note of about the Declaration of Independence is that it is not a governing document, right? It does not govern us today in any way, shape, or form, but we'd still consider it very important for these sort of reasons here, because it kind of outlines what exactly the purpose of the United States is, right? Why it exists. The actual governing document is this, the Articles of Confederation, right? We'll talk about this more. Right now, all you need to know is that this was the first constitution of the U.S., right? Currently, we're in Constitution number 2. We just refer to our current Constitution as the Constitution, but the Articles of Confederation was the first Constitution of the U.S. This would be a governing document, right? This dictates what the laws are, how the government is set up, what the rules are, et cetera, et cetera. And so after that declaration was signed on July 4th, 1776, or ratified July 4th, 1776, these two notions right here, right, this idea of a war and independence, these things pretty much now become one in the same. And it becomes a lot more simpler of an equation. And that is, if the United States can win the war, then it will be independent. Whereas before, really during this early phase, 1774 to 1776, a lot of the fighting that was going on, like the Battle of Lexington and Concord, neither side really had a clear objective in terms of what they were fighting for. After 1776, it's evident, right, that this war means, for the colonies, it means to separate, and for the British, it means to retain possession of the colonies. Now, when the war broke out, mobilizing for the conflict was going to be difficult for the what we'll now just call the American side. We can stop referring to the English colonies as colonies, and we can now start referring to them as states. We can now start referring to the people living in the Americas not as colonists, but now as Americans. Essentially, 1776, July 4th is that date. So it was going to be much more difficult now for the Americans to fight against the British. But there were a couple of ways that the Americans prepared. One was to issue a continental currency. Again, that we might call this a continental dollar. This would be used to pay the troops, right? Pay the troops, and really just for the war in general. Like we mentioned before, George Washington was put in charge of the Continental Army. So we might say the Continental General. Right? All fighting forces were put under his command. Marquis de Lafayette, he was a French general. We'll talk more about this in a second, but he assisted the U.S. cause. He actually came to the colonies to fight on behalf of the United States. And French support is going to be instrumental in how this conflict eventually plays out. Now, when we look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of the conflict, Great Britain held most of the significant advantages in this war. Great Britain had a bigger army, had a bigger navy, had more money, had, in some cases, a functioning and better government. There are a lot of things that the British have on their side. Population is another one. We might even add superior weapons, or at least access to more weapons. That's kind of tied to money a little bit. But the Americans did have some distinctive advantages that are worth noting. One, we might say that the war was fought on home soil, right? This war would have to be fought in the colonies. And that was an advantage to the Americans because the British had to mobilize and send all of their resources across the Atlantic. And back in those days, that took a very long time, right, in order to get those resources there. We might also say that the Americans fought more on the defensive. That means in order for the British to win, they were required to attack. Essentially, the winning strategy for the American side is, to not lose. And that's not technically the same thing as winning, especially in the ways that wars were fought kind of in a pre-modern era. Typically it was with, capturing the capital city of a country would be kind of like a signal or sign for victory. And so, there was no imperative, there was no need for the Americans to send an army and capture London. That was not in the objective of the war. Essentially, as long as the American side doesn't lose, then independence is a possibility. It's sort of a strategy of hold on, right? And that's all the Americans had to do. The last American advantage that we might take note of, we're going to call this morale. Morale is fighting spirit. That is the reason why you fight. So, for example, if we look back up at some of the soldiers that participated on the British side, and this was the case, Hessians and soldiers for hire also fought on the Continental side. There's no doubt about it. But when, the motivations for Hessians are, money, they're looking for some sort of financial incentive. Whereas a lot of Americans will be fighting for their homes, fighting for their schools, fighting for their churches, fighting for their communities. And this is especially true during the later stages of the war, where British armies are actively engaged in the destruction of colonial property, right? There's the motivation of revenge in some areas. So, with all this being said, yes, we could say there are some things that the Americans have, but by far the most important advantages belong to the British, right? Just the sheer size of their army, the fact that the British have so much more money, a much more well-functioning government, right? All sort of play out for the British side. The first phase of the war, that's what we might call 1774 to 1776. We might also say this is kind of like the improvised phase. Nobody really knows why they're fighting or what they're fighting for. Most of this is going on in New England, especially in Boston. And it's following the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where, the British general Gage was given orders to confiscate colonial weapons, and Minutemen turned out and stopped it and, fired upon them. At that time, most of the British soldiers had retreated back into Boston. The Patriots, this is a term that we'll use to describe the side that supports independence. right? So anybody that agreed with breaking away from Great Britain, we would consider or call them a patriot. A loyalist are those that side with Great Britain, right? So we have patriots, those that want independence, loyalists, those that want to stay with the British. We have a group of people that are neutral, that really don't care about what side. And if we look at the colonial population, we would say about 33% wanted to break away, 33% wanted to stay, and 33% didn't care, or could go either way, essentially. So, just the fact that, a minority of people in the colonies actually supported the idea of separating from Great Britain gives you a little bit more of an indication of just how difficult this feat would be. But regardless, the Patriots in Boston that wanted to make sure that no British aggression would take place again, more or less put Boston under siege. The British didn't appreciate it, and the battle, put battle here, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred when British soldiers attacked, we might say fortified Patriots. We'll do that. All right, so this was a battle that took place in the early phases of the war. Essentially, the British didn't like the fact that they were being essentially embargoed is the wrong term. I'm trying to think of the term right here. They were essentially being kind of like bottled up. The Minutemen were not allowing the British soldiers to leave Boston, right? They were kind of like imprisoned there. And so the British didn't like that and wanted to try and break out and attacked the Patriots there. This image right here is showing you the Battle of Bunker Hill. And even though the British were successful in capturing the hill, they suffered heavy losses and in fact retreated to Canada in order to regroup and reassess what exactly was going on. Meanwhile, a lot of the Patriots took to raiding and taking over British fortifications. One thing that the Patriots learned from Bunker Hill was that they needed more weapons. There was not enough ammunition. You may have heard this phrase before, but the Patriot or American general said, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." That order or command was because the American side was so low on ammunition that in order to save it, you shouldn't shoot unless you, again, can see the whites of their eyes. They're very close. And so again, the point that I want to emphasize here is that there's no really like overall goal in mind. There's no overall strategy for either one. This is just violence going on in the North. The second phase of the conflict of the American Revolutionary War is after 1776. And that point that I made earlier about, well, now it's very clear what the objectives of the war are, right? That if the continental side wins or the American side wins, it means breaking away and creating an independent country. Meanwhile, if the British side wins, it means retaining their colonial possessions. Now, George Washington was given command of the Continental Army. However, time and time again, there were many early American defeats. All right, the war did not go well for the U.S. side, especially early on. George Washington, in fact, was almost captured practically at the very beginning of the war, managed to retreat. But again, in order for the American side to win, they didn't really need to win on the battlefield. However, losing battle after battle after battle did have an adverse effect on the Continental Army in two ways. One, in terms of morale, right? If you look at the overall picture, it's fine. If Washington retreats all day, that's fine, because as long as he's not captured, essentially independence is possible. But the fighting spirit of the Continental troops, it begins to be diminished. And there aren't many people as eager to go off and fight and lose battle after battle after battle, right? Nobody wants to do that. And it was really big for recruitment, right? Recruitment. And this was think there's an I in there, recruitment. And this was big to get recruits because this is going to end up being one of the biggest problems for the Continental Army, is to have the manpower to continue to fight. You know, if we look at the US side during the course of the American Revolution, it is, you know, do they have enough soldiers to fight? And do they have enough weapons to fight? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And losing battle after battle after battle does not bode well for recruitment. So a slightly different strategy was required, which forced George Washington to take greater risk. The Battle of Trenton and Princeton were both American victories. Now, again, these battles were not important kind of from a strategic sort of point of view. The British didn't suffer any catastrophic casualties. It didn't force the British off the mainland. In fact, the Battle of Trenton is when Washington crossed the Delaware at midnight, captured a number of Hessian troops. It's the battle for which this iconic painting comes from. You know, sailing across a frozen river at midnight on Christmas Eve to surprise attack your enemy is not exactly a position of strength, or demonstrating that. But these were important victories for the sheer reason of morale, for the fact that the United States could point to something and say, look, at least there's something that we won. And for that reason, maybe perhaps more people would recruit. But, you know, again, when you look at the actual experience of the British Army and the experience of the US Army, there is really no question in terms of who's winning this conflict. Philadelphia fell to the British, right? So we might say the British captured. And even though there was not technically a capital of the United States, this was more, yes, the US capital, right? This was the biggest city in the 13 colonies. At this point, both Philadelphia and New York, the two largest cities in the colonies, had been captured by British armies. Philadelphia is where the Continental Congress had been meeting. And in 1777, especially, you know, 1 year after independence, there's a very stark contrast between what's going on either side. There are British armies and British, loyalists celebrating in Philadelphia, shooting off fireworks, throwing these very elaborate balls and festivals and masquerades. And meanwhile, George Washington and his men are enduring a very tough winter at Valley Forge. So we might say Washington and his soldiers, we might say, endured a harsh winter. People were starving to death, freezing to death. Desertion was at an all-time high. And again, kind of really points to this contrast between what's going on. You know, the continental side is starving to death. Valley Forge is in western Pennsylvania. It's just the area of a location where Washington and his men stayed while the British were partying it up in Philadelphia. But, despite enduring those tough conditions, I just realized I wrote 1776 twice. The Continental Army and, the cause continued to go. Now, in terms of the actual battle, or all the battles that take place during the Revolutionary period, there is none more important than Saratoga. So I'll go ahead and write this in a different color just to illustrate that point. If you only remember one single battle from the entire Revolution, have it be the Battle of Saratoga. This was an American victory. And the turning point of the war. Essentially, a British force from Canada was moving south to provide reinforcements to other British troops in Philadelphia and New York that were already successful. American troops intercepted the British at Saratoga, again in northern New York, and defeated them there. And the reason why it's important is down to this point down here. And that was because during the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, who was the most important and most popular person in the colonies before the Revolutionary period, had gone to France seeking French support. And when he got there, he really took the palace by storm. Recall that France was an absolute monarchy, meaning that he really only needed to convince the king. The king resided at the very elaborate Palace of Versailles. And in order to gain an audience with him, and in order to gain kind of like a, on his good side, you might say, Franklin was required to be like the most popular kid in school, or like the most popular kid at Versailles. And he did a really good job of doing that. He portrayed himself as this sort of frontiersman, living on, from French perspective, living on the edge of civilization. He had experimented with lightning, which made him all the more interesting. And he really took the court by storm, and everybody wanted to be on, Franklin's side and hang out with him and talk with him and discuss with him, including the King of France. But the French had one big reservation, and that was the fact they may have sympathized with the American cause. They definitely wanted to get back at Great Britain, right, for what the British did to them during the 7 Years' War. So the French want revenge. They might think Benjamin Franklin's a really cool guy, but the thing that the British were, the thing that the French were the most hesitant about was the ability for the American side to win, right? And I like to make this comparison is that sometimes, take like a sporting event, for example, you might be willing to root for an underdog, but you're not willing to bet on the underdog because you're a little bit more hesitant when it comes to actually putting your money where your mouth is. And that's kind of where the French were at. The French were willing to root for the Americans, but they weren't willing to bet on the Americans until the Battle of Saratoga. When the Americans won at Saratoga, it proved that the U.S. could win. That was evidence. Franklin could say, look, we won this battle here. French forces were defeated. We can actually win this war. And so France came in to support the American side. After Saratoga. Right, again, and that's why that battle is so significant. One thing that made the American war effort a little bit easier, we'll also mention here, again, the Iroquois Confederacy, who played a role in this region for, really ever since the first colonists arrived, declared their neutrality. And again, this would be one less faction that the American side would have to worry about fighting against. So after the French supported the U.S. side, it really became a matter of, the tide of the battle quickly changed. So just to give you one example, Great Britain was forced to retreat half of their forces from the U.S. to prepare in case of a French attack at home. One thing that the French also brought that was significant was the French Navy. Really there was no Navy to speak of practically for the continental side. It existed, but it really stood no match for, against the British. But the French Navy could fight the British, whereas the American Navy couldn't. And so this greatly changed the trajectory of the conflict. The British, growing more and more desperate, not seeing a victory early on, not able to capture Washington, changed their strategy. And the final phase of the war is focused mostly on the Southern Colonies. And the reason why the British became more involved in the South was because there tended to be perhaps more loyalists there. And during the later stages of the war, loyalist enlistment, that is, what we might say colonists, fighting for Britain, increased dramatically. This last phase of the war, if we had to put a year on it, the capture of Philadelphia is in 1777. Maybe we'll say, I don't know exactly when French intervention comes. But we might just say something like 1778 is when we'll go ahead and write that in. About 1780. 83 is technically when the war comes to an end. 81 is when the fighting actually stops. But anyways, right? And this last phase of the war is, again, now being fought in the Southern Colonies. So we can also kind of match up these places geographically. Early on, almost all fighting is exclusively in New England, Massachusetts. Later on, it's in places like New York and Philadelphia, the most populous areas. And again, that was because the British, suspected that capturing the largest and most significant cities in the colonies would be a way of victory, especially kind of the idea of a pre-modern war dictates that capturing the capital city equals victory. And then in the South, because the British weren't seeing any progress, right? The British didn't want to go to New England because in New England, that's where the most Patriots were. The British would be in for the toughest fight if they attacked New England. In fact, during the entire course of the war, after Bunker Hill, the British never returned to Massachusetts. None of the fighting after that takes place in Massachusetts, but rather in the South because they can enlist more colonists to fight for their side. And it's true. This last phase of the war is almost like a civil war. It is colonists fighting colonists. It's brother against brother. It's father against son, etc., etc. In fact, if you actually look at, in American history, we call the American Civil War the war of brother against brother. But the American Revolution was actually the war in which you were much more likely to have family members fighting and killing each other. Because when you think about it, the American Civil War was the northern states versus the southern states. If all of one family lived in one state, it was likely that they would all fight for the same side. That wasn't always the case. There were plenty of examples of people from Maryland who one brother maybe fought for the Union and one fought for the Confederacy. But here in the American Revolution, one of the first places the British go to is Georgia. And immediately it becomes, well, you're either going to come out and sign up for the British or you're going to sign up for the American side. And in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in Virginia, it is essentially, again, a war of colonists versus colonists, one being enlisted for the British, one being enlisted for the American side. That wasn't the case before. Before, the British had only used troops from Great Britain, right, the professional redcoats. But later on in the war, they had grown desperate to the point where they sought to enlist people in the colonies. This was, when we look at this war in the South, this was a war of brutality. This was a war of occupation. In the initial stages of the conflict, it was pretty much army versus army on the battlefield. This is at a time when there were certain rules to war. War was considered like a gentleman's sport almost, as ridiculous as that sounds. But that's not how the war went in the South. It was civilian versus civilian. It was houses being burned down, churches being burned down, a war of occupation, a war in which sides would surrender and then butcher each other after that. It was a really ugly affair in the South. The U.S. experienced a gut punch, you might say. One Benedict Arnold, a U.S., we'll just say general. I don't know his exact title. Turned treasonous. He defected to the British side. In fact, he was one of the most famous and most able and most respected and well-known generals for the U.S. side. But he defected, to the British, and forever Benedict Arnold's name gets, his name will be forever used to describe traitors, right? People that are treasonous. He was pretty much just in it for the money for the most part. He had other motives for going for the British side, but money can go a long way. And so during this last phase of the conflict, 1778 to 1781, the British Army is more or less marching unopposed until they get to Yorktown, Virginia. And at Yorktown, Virginia, the British Army, waiting for supplies, gets surrounded by U.S. forces by land and French forces by sea, essentially being trapped in the middle. And it was at Yorktown that the British Army surrendered. Right, the British Army surrendered. And that marked the ending of the American Revolution. Right. So the Battle of Yorktown, U.S. forces by land, French forces by sea. The British Army was forced to surrender. That brought an end to the American Revolution. Now, when the war is over, it took a little bit more time to discuss the peace settlement. I want to see 1783, I want to say, is when it was. Oops, the Peace of Paris. Unfortunately, all of these treaties are called the Peace of Paris. Paris was a very popular place to sign treaties in back in the day. Dictated some pretty important conditions for the U.S. side. Number one was territory or land. We'll look at it in a moment here, but Great Britain not only surrendered U.S. independence, which is also something that we'll write here, so U.S. independence. So not only did the British acknowledge that the United States, broke away, it was now a separate country. The British essentially gave up possession of the 13 colonies. The British also gave the United States a lot of land and a lot of territory, and this would actually play out to be a pretty important role there. And generally speaking, the Peace of Paris was very, beneficial for the American side. It wiped off all pre-existing debts, for example. The only thing that the American side had to agree to for this was that the American side agreed that they wouldn't persecute loyalists. Right? So, for example, if there was somebody now in the United States, that the American side would not persecute them. They would let them keep their property, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, in terms of the grand scheme of things, note the Battle of Saratoga as being a very important turning point in there. Also note, I would say here, advantages and disadvantages for sure. This is a very popular type of question that I like to ask. What were the advantages and disadvantages for each side? And then some of the reasons for the push for independence. Okay, so any questions about the American Revolutionary War? Okay, so it sounds like everyone's okay. Okay. So recall now, I'll just take a moment. We're gonna finish up the chapter here. Talk a little bit about what happens after the revolution, but recall that for your essay question, pretty much, this is, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but more or less all the content and information that you need to do or need in order to answer that second essay question, and that is who is responsible for the outbreak. Oops. Looks like my computer's freezing up on me a bit. There we go. Who is responsible for the outbreak and or outcome of the revolution what we might call the American colonists or Great Britain? Right. So in tackling this question, right, and we might say, we could also put blame, responsible, blame, whatever it is. You more or less have all the content now, right? You have the basic understanding of what happened. And in your essay, if you only want to talk, for example, about the outbreak of the war, you can do that. If you only want to talk about the outcome of the war, you can do that. If you want to talk about both of them, that's perfectly fine as well. But you should have a pretty good understanding of what happened, right? These were the events. Now it's really up to you to decide for yourself, okay, which side is the most responsible? Maybe I'll add that here because this is actually... So I do write in the essay prompt the most. That forces you to pick a side, right? You have to say that one side was more responsible than another. Sure, there's shared responsibility, but if you have to blame it on one side, who is it? And then tackle it, tackle it like that. So maybe next class we'll go over some of the primary sources a little bit, talk about how they can fit in with the, with the rest of the essay, and kind of talk more about it. It's not due for a while, so you don't have to worry about it, but it's on this content, right? This information here. Yes. He is part of this war, but he hasn't reached the position for which he'll be most known for. During the American Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton served under George Washington. He was kind of like Washington's right-hand man in a lot of ways. So he was side by side with Washington pretty much during this entire thing. But Washington gets kind of all the credit. It's after the revolution is over, when George Washington is elected president and he's looking for people to appoint in the government, he appoints his trusty sidekick Hamilton, and it's when Hamilton is appointed to the government that he, where his important contributions to American history are. So, yes, he was here during this war, but maybe not a significant contributor to it until a little bit later. Yeah. Okay, so let's focus on kind of the last portion of chapter 5 here. So a lot of this stuff here afterwards talks about the consequences. One thing that we should ask is really how revolutionary was this conflict, right? What were the consequences? I mean, a revolution sort of suggests that there was a lot of change that took place, and certainly there was. The United States was created, which was the first government on the planet Earth to be established on Enlightenment principles. That was significant. Again, the United States now exists, whereas it didn't before. It's still going to take a little while for the U.S. to kind of work out the details on exactly what does this mean in terms of like legal rights, for example. We'll talk about that more. But you could also say that even though the revolution did create this new type of government, right, based on Enlightenment principles, that maybe for just like everyday people in the colonies, maybe not a lot changed all that much. So, for example, if we look at Loyalists in particular, maybe other minority populations, we'll talk more about that in detail, but Loyalists in particular, many Loyalists fled the U.S. Right? If you were supporting the British cause, there is no doubt that you didn't want to stick around and see what happened to you after all the fighting was over. Even though the U.S. agreed that no persecution would take place, many left for places like Canada. Right, Canada. In terms of slavery, very important in terms of the impact that the American Revolution had on slavery. So one was that it abolished, well, that's a little bit misleading. right? So we'll say instead, the American Revolution did not end slavery in the U.S. However, at the same time, it did sometimes, what I like to say is it did kind of deal a mortal wound to the institution, right? On the one hand, the revolutionary ideas contradicted the institution of slavery. Oops. Just say contradicted slavery. So, for example, how could a person like Thomas Jefferson say that all men are created equal, that they have rights like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but also at the same time own more than 200 slaves, right? These ideas contradicted. A lot of the ideas that were related to the Enlightenment talked about things like equality and democracy. But, this was, these ideas were enough to, like I said before, maybe damage slavery in the United States, but certainly did not end it. So, for example, after the ending of the American Revolution, the northern states, and again, they're states now, they're not colonies, because the revolution was successful. The northern states gradually abolish slavery. It was only in one state or two states? One state, I believe. Maybe two states. I think Massachusetts, I want to say New Hampshire was the only one. Maybe just Massachusetts, where slavery was abolished immediately. In other words, slaves in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, there weren't very many of them, but those that were there, as soon as the Revolutionary War was over and state governments were created, those states of Massachusetts and New Hampshire abolished slavery immediately, making those people who were enslaved there free overnight. For most slaves in the North, emancipation looked much more gradual. That is to say, states like Pennsylvania, states like New York, states like Connecticut, they essentially wrote laws saying something like this, that once the children of slaves reach the age of 25, they will then become free. Or, all slaves who are currently slaves remain, that way, but their children will be free, right? So some type of law that makes it an institution that gradually eradicates over time. Whereas when we look specifically, and here it is, gradual emancipation in the North, right? I even have it written here. Where we look at the states of the South, right? Not only did the southern states not move to gradually abolish it, but the southern states sought to protect it and even imported more slaves. This is especially true in places like South Carolina and Georgia. Because of the effect of the revolutionary ideas, some states allowed for manumission. A manument or a manumission is when a slave owner willingly frees his slaves or her slaves. Probably more likely his slaves in most cases. A good example of this is George Washington. George Washington, a slave owner, wrote in his will that when he and his wife dies, that his slaves would be free. We would call that manumission. And manumission was used especially in some of the northern, upper South, we call it, not the northern South, but the upper South. Places like Virginia and Maryland. In a place like Maryland, for example, perhaps 20% of slaves achieved emancipation through manumission. But it's this contrast here, and this, especially foreshadows, kind of what direction we'll be going in this. But the idea that southern states sought to protect, and the fact that northern states moved to gradually abolish slavery, sends the United States on this trajectory where the two parts of the country, North and South, are, they end up in very, very different places. And of course, we'll talk a lot more about that. So again, the war did not end slavery in the U.S., but it did, lead to the gradual emancipation in the North and, lead to things like manumission. In terms of Native Americans, generally speaking, Native Americans were worse off after the American Revolution. Many tribes and groups had to struggle with kind of where to set themselves up as during this war. Some, like the Iroquois, remained neutral. Some tribes fought for the British. Some tribes fought for the some fought for the American side. But the reason why Native Americans were mostly worse off in the aftermath was because of all the land the British had essentially surrendered. If we recall, and again, this is good review, the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, if you don't remember what the Proclamation Line of 1763 is, go back and look that up and review it. But at the very least, there was some sort of barrier between colonial settlement of the West and, Native American territory. Now with the British gone, that Proclamation Line is gone, right? So at the very least, we could say that especially Western tribes were now worse off because the British were no longer preventing any type of restrictions on this move westward. And in fact, even after the Battle of Yorktown had occurred, fighting continued between the United States and Native Americans who had allied themselves with the British, continued to go on in the West, even 1782, 1783, and some of the years afterwards. In terms of the rights of women and the roles that they play in society, for the most part, we would say that this was unchanged. There were some important, important things to take note of. Abigail Adams' letter, Remember the Ladies, is Abigail Adams first was the wife of John Adams. John Adams, who was an instrumental piece to the Declaration of Independence. He'll be there when it comes to writing the first and second constitutions. John Adams was from Massachusetts. But Abigail Adams reminded John to, when all you men meet to write this new constitution, please remember the ladies, remember your wives, remember your daughters. Her letter was not very well received, but certainly this letter is, kind of a, maybe a promotion. I don't know if promotion is the right word. Certainly a support. Letter is in support of women's, at the very least, political rights. After the American Revolution, when it comes to voting, voting is usually a good indication of, at least in this time, political rights. When it came to voting, every single state determined their own voting law. So this was state decided. So this would not be decided on a federal level. And for the most part, voting had three criteria, especially in the early phases. One was that you had to be male. And so, again, Abigail Adams, her letter, again, is not well received by John Adams, her husband. And for the most part, there's very little discussion about the role that women will play in the new, the new republic. Voting was done on the state side. It required that only men be allowed to vote. It required that they be white, in a sense. The term that was used at the time was white persons. And that they had to either pay taxes or own property. We'll talk more about voting laws in particular, but it was very restrictive, at least in sort of a modern sense. And part of that, we'll talk about why that is, but part of that was because voting was seen much less like a right and maybe even a privilege, and was seen more like a duty, right, a responsibility. There was one state that did allow for women to vote, but it was, you might say, an oversight. That was New Jersey. They essentially wrote the law in New Jersey that stated all property owners could vote. Later on in the 1800s, 1810-ish, they amended that law to state that all male property owners could vote. So for a very, very short time, women were voting. I believe it was New Jersey, but everywhere else it was only relegated to men. However, one way you might say that women's rights did change was specifically in the field of education. Judith Sargent Murray was an advocate for women's education. Pretty much stated that it was the inability for women to access education that was used to justify, excluding them from certain public, arenas, you might say, and that if the education gap was closed, then all the other gaps essentially would close as well. Especially one change that you see is in the field of teaching. So, for example, teaching is a field that becomes, you have a lot more representation of women in teaching after the American Revolution than you did before. So if there was going to be one area of change in terms of women's lives from the American Revolution, it might be in this field here. And instead, your textbook uses this term Republican citizenry. I like to use this term called, it's a little bit more famous, Republican motherhood. And that is to say, what is the role for women in revolutionary society? Well, very clearly, for the men who are creating the political laws, it's not going to be in holding office. It's not going to be in terms of voting. Instead, it was kind of pigeonholed into this idea here. Republican motherhood is what you see in this picture. And Republican motherhood essentially stated that it was the role of women in revolutionary society to teach their children about all of those things, right? Liberty, freedom, right, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that was sort of this notion here. And we'll talk more about how women's rights in particular evolve over time in the United States. But if we look at the American Revolution as being a catalyst for any type of change, it would be maybe when it came to the role of teaching and this notion of Republican motherhood and the responsibility of women in American society. Lastly, one thing that we want to say about the consequence of the revolution is on the economy. And just generally speaking, the revolution really led to a very disastrous economy for the U.S. We'll talk more about the economic problems. So in this section here, again, just kind of looking at the way that the war affected society. What did it mean for Loyalists? What did it mean for slavery? What did the war mean for Native Americans? What did it mean for women? And what did it mean for the economy? Any questions about some of the consequences of the war and how it affected kind of the different parts of American society? Okay, so let's wrap it up here. So one of the biggest debates, or maybe one of the biggest problems for the United States, was creating a new government, right? What type of government? Like we said before, the Articles of Confederation was the first U.S. Constitution. All right, first U.S. Constitution. More or less, there was a Congress, right? Just like the Second Continental Congress. And each of the 13 states were represented at the Congress, right? So you might have Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, right? You get the point, right? And they all meet at this national level. In Philadelphia, typically, was where they met. And in order to pass a law, because that's one thing that Congress does, or first I might say, in regards to the Congress, I'll go ahead so I got more room to write over here. Come on, there we go. So we might say each state gets one vote. All right, so that's the rules. So in order to pass a law, 9 out of 13 need to vote yes on a law, right? So that is over 50%. In order to provide an amendment, 13 out of 13. All right, does that make sense? All right, so each state gets one vote. When it comes to passing a law, 9 out of 13 have to say yes. An amendment means to change the articles, like if you're going to change fundamentally what the rule book is for how the government operates, then 13 out of 13 are required. In other words, it would be very hard to pass laws. And this was actually done on purpose because the Confederation government wanted to make sure that the states would be very sure of themselves when they passed various legislation, right? Laws, whatever else it might be. It also meant that it wouldn't be maybe not as responsive to problems, right? And that was, that would end up being an issue, right? Especially if there was some sort of amendment that was required. And it was these problems here that we'll talk about that really plague this Confederation period, because this Confederation government right here lasts from, we'll say, 1777 roughly till about 1789. This Constitution only ruled the United States for about 10 years or so. And then the founders ditched it. They got rid of it and they wrote the Constitution that we have today. And part of the reason as to why that happened was because of the way that the government functioned, right? In terms of, how it was difficult to pass laws and difficult to pass amendments, and it was not responsive to some of the problems. And also due to some of its limits. So for example, I'm going to talk about some limitations of the government, things that it could not do that really hindered its ability to function. The Articles of Confederation could not draft an army. Right? Again, these are things that the Articles cannot do. Right? That was a problem. The biggest problem was that it can't raise taxes. This ends up being a huge issue because one of the things related to the war economy is the fact that the United States has a huge debt. We're running out of room. So how do you pay off a huge war debt if you can't raise taxes? Well, therein lies part of the problem. And for the most part, when it came to the Articles of Government, states had all the power. Right? A good way to think about this government, the Articles government, is to think of it as like pretty much a very loose alliance between all the states. It's kind of like each state is their own separate country and can do whatever they want. Whereas there's just a couple of things that the Articles can do, right? It can borrow money. It can open up diplomacy overseas, for example, right? Sign peace treaties. It can do those things. But when push comes to shove, the states have all the power. And because it can't draft an army, because it can't raise taxes, and because it's very difficult to pass laws, all these problems go unheard of. So we'll talk more here about some of the problems. Some of the disagreements emerged in this period. We'll talk more about the disagreements, right? One of the big ones was how voting was done. Well, let me take that back. It's not really voting. It's, well, we'll just say laws. All right, we'll talk about that more, though. Disagreements about this. One thing that the treaty did do right, though, when we look at the articles, here's what we need to say. All right, this is what it boils down to. The Articles of Confederation government was a failure, and it was too weak to function. In other words, the founders were so, so caught up in this idea of creating a weak government because they had just fought a war with what they believed was a strong government. And the last thing they wanted to do was to create another overbearing, powerful state. They were so concerned with creating a weak government that the government that was created was simply just too weak to function, too weak to solve the problems of the nation. One of those problems was rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. This was a rebellion by Massachusetts farmers. Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and a lot of farmers who were overtaxed and put in debt and put in prison for not paying back their taxes. Daniel Shays and a group of veterans from the Revolutionary War began breaking people out of prison. And the fact that the Articles government could not deal with this rebellion adequately, the fact that it could not draft an army and put down Daniel Shays' rebellion, gave a lot of people reservation about the future of the country and whether or not it could survive. George Washington in particular said, look, if the United States can't fight a bunch of farmers, how's the U.S. going to fight against France or fight against Great Britain if it has to go to war? So especially those who were in the military were alarmed by Shays' rebellion, said something needs to be done. There needs to be a more powerful national government that can deal with this. In terms of economics, debt, business, one of those people who were especially worried about the U.S. economy at this time was Alexander Hamilton, who said there needs to be new, stronger laws in order to pay down the war debt. There needs to be an ability for the United States to regulate business in some way, to not let every single state do whatever they want, right? So a lot of different failures. The judicial branch was also a giant headache, right? 13 different legal systems. You could imagine what it would be like to try and do anything in a country where there are 13 different, legal systems, 13 different tax codes. It was a headache, and it did not lead to a very prosperous or functioning society. And so in 1787, and we'll get to this next chapter, the founders agreed to essentially start over, right? To ditch the Articles government, draft a new constitution. We'll talk about those details, because this one was simply just a failure. But before we get to that, and the last thing that I'm going to say today is the one place where the Articles government succeeded, and that was land. Right? When it came to land, the Articles government figured out what to do with this territory. So let's look at this map here. Everything in the green represents territory that was ceded to the U.S. by Great Britain. So for winning the American Revolutionary War, not only did the U.S. become independent, but it also came to take all of this land, essentially doubling in size, right? With the intention of course, settling it. The Confederation government pretty much got all of the colonies to give up any sort of claims that they had. Again, there was some infighting between the states about who should claim what land in the West, and reorganized it in a way that really outlined the way that Western territory would forever be, handled in the U.S. The land ordinances of 1784 and 1785, this sold land to pay the war debt, right, which was very important. The Northwest Ordinance was very important in particular. It created a method for new states to be added there was a lot of disagreement about whether or not any new states would be added. The Confederation government figured that they would add new states. And not only would new states be added, but they would be equal. And this was, again, this was actually unlikely, because if we look at the creation of the Congress, right, what would adding a new state do to the voting? Right, let's say we add Tennessee. Well, now that creates a 14-state rule. And so each state now is less powerful than it was before. And the fact that these states were willing to agree to allow for new states to be created, and the way they would be created is when a territory got to a certain population. So as more and more people moved out west, then those territories could be turned into states, and then those states would get a say in the Congress, right? They'd get voting rights. When it came to laws. One very important thing about the Northwest Ordinance as well is that it banned slavery. Talk more about it. Essentially, if we look up here, I'm not sure how well we can all see it, but this is what the Northwest Ordinance is. So it said new states would be created in this territory, and it would be free soil, right? And it would be free soil. That kind of sets the stage for an ever increasingly divided South. However, though, as we know, that land in the West was not completely, it wasn't uninhabited. Native Americans occupied those territories for a very long time. The Battle of the Fallen Timbers was U.S. victory over what we're just going to call Ohio tribes. And the Treaty of Greenville, again, running out of room here, opened Ohio and generally just the Northwest Territory here for U.S. settlement. So there's still conflict to be had there, but the United States did emerge victorious in that particular region. So when it came to this question of Western lands and Western territories, the ability for the United States to sell land to pay off war debt, the ability for the U.S. to create new states and have those states be equal to the existing ones, and to successfully wage war against the people who inhabited in those regions, we would say for those reasons, the Confederation period did a pretty good job with this question of Western land. But when it came to everything else, it was just an utter failure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next class. But I'll go ahead and I'll end it right there.